I would like to welcome you all to our panel discussion, How Reg BI Works, a Broker-Dealer's View of Reg BI Implementation. This is the second in our series of events examining the implementation of Regulation Best Interest. While we get started, let me just give you a few household keeping requests as we start the program. Please note, as with any of the Chamber's public events, we are recording this webinar. We ask that all participants ensure their microphones are on mute so that we can minimize the background noise while our panelists and moderator are speaking. For those who are accessing the webinar via video conference, we also ask that you turn off the video option so that our participants will only be viewing our four guests. If you are interested in asking a question of our panelists, we ask that our attendees type their questions into the chat function of Microsoft Teams. We look forward to an engaging discussion. As you all know, the CCMC has long supported Regulation Best Interest, as we believe it provides an important set of investor protections while also preserving investor choice. We are now 3 months into the implementation of the new rulemaking, so we are just starting to learn more about how broker-dealers are faring in meeting with the Regulation Best Interest requirements. Broker-dealers had just over a year to implement Regulation BI and Form CRS, which went into effect on June 30th of this year. We know that the implementation of Regulation Best Interest and Form CRS required a significant undertaking by each company working with their compliance, legal, operations, IT, and brokerage teams to determine the necessary actions and processes needed to effectively adopt Regulation Best Interests. This very substantial effort, of course, came after the same teams had to put in as much hard work with trying to implement the DOL's fiduciary duty rule, which the courts overturned in 2018. We have a great panel today that will explore, among other issues, the challenges surrounding implementation and what they've learned in the 3 months that Regulation Best Interest has been in effect. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Michael Piwowar. He is currently Executive Director of the Milken Institute Center for Financial Markets and is also a Distinguished Policy Fellow at Georgetown University Center for Financial Markets and Policy. Dr. Piwowar serves as SEC Commissioner from 2013 to 2018, and during his tenure, he also was the acting chairman in early 2017. I could tell you that during his time as acting chairman, he restarted the regulatory process, which led us down to the road of Regulation Best Interest. Prior to being at the SEC, Dr. Piwowar served as chief economist for the U.S. Senate Banking Committee, as well as a senior economist at the President's Council of Economic Advisors in both the Bush 43 and Obama administrations. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Piwowar as he moderates our expert panel. And Dr. Piwowar, let me turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Tom, for that very, very kind introduction. And I want to thank you and all your colleagues at the Chamber of Commerce, and especially at the Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness, for your steadfast commitment to fair, transparent, efficient, innovative capital markets. During my time as a public official, as you mentioned, at the White House, the Senate, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, I've always appreciated the thoughtful and insights that you and your team brought to policymakers on behalf of your diverse members. The topic of today's webinar, the SEC's Regulation Best Interest and the related Customer Relationship Summary, more commonly known as Reg BI and Form CRS, is no exception. I was at the Commission when Reg BI and Form CRS was proposed in April of 2018 as part of a package of rules designed to address the obligations of broker-dealers and investment advisors when they provide recommendations or investment advice to retail investors. Reg BI enhanced the broker-dealer standard beyond the existing suitability obligations. Among other things, it required broker-dealers to act in the best interest of a retail customer when making a recommendation of any securities transaction or investment strategy involving securities. Form CRS is a relationship summary designed to help retail investors make informed choices regarding whether a brokerage or investment advisor relationship, as well as whether a particular broker dealer or investment advisor best suits their particular needs and circumstances. The relationship summary promotes transparency and better formed decision-making through clear, concise disclosures and by summarizing them in one place, selected information about a particular firm. About almost 1 year after I left the commission at the expiration of my term, the SEC adopted Regulation Best Interest and Form CRS in June of 2019. And as Tom mentioned, the rules went into effect a few months ago on June 30th. Today, we're going to get views on Reg BI implementation from key representatives at 3 broker dealers whose senior management teams have consistently been very generous with their time and in providing helpful comments and feedback to policymakers on behalf of their Main Street investor clients. Our first distinguished panelist is Julie Rue, Vice President of Supervision and Fiduciary Services at Raymond James Financial Incorporated. Julie has over 10 years of experience in the financial industry with a focus on fiduciary services with both institutional and retail customers. She currently leads the program for implementation of Reg BI for Raymond James. Next, we're pleased to welcome Teresa Stays, Vice President and Chief Counsel and Chief Global Conflicts Officer at Ameriprise Financial Services, LLC. Teresa provides counsel regarding Regulation Best Interest, the Advisor's Fiduciary Standard, State Fiduciary and Best Interest Standards, ERISA, and FINRA regulation. She was previously appointed by the Secretary of Labor to serve on the ERISA Advisory Council to the Department of Labor. And last, but certainly not least, we're delighted to welcome Karen Sukin, Executive Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of Prime America Incorporated. Karen serves as the Office of General Counsel's Executive Vice President of Technology, Securities, and Public Affairs. Her responsibilities include General Counsel to the Securities business, Head of Corporate Contracts, and Head of Government Relations. So let's get right into the discussion today. As Tom mentioned, implementing Reg BI and Form CRS has been a large undertaking for firms. So while the rules have been in effect for only 3 months, firms like yours have spent more than a year preparing for its implementation. So let's start off with the threshold question. What were the biggest challenges you think firms have faced in terms of working with their compliance, legal, operations, IT, and brokerage teams as they adopted Reg BI? And let's start off with Julie for this question.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Well, I would say the biggest challenge is one that maybe sounds simple when you first say it, a 2, maybe 4-page disclosure document that is supposed to cover really a lot of ground, but be concise, and then also finding out the ways to deliver this disclosure with the new requirements form client relationship summary, the Form CRS. I think for Raymond James, and I think for many in the industry, the compilation and creation of this document, but then also how to deliver it, how to train advisors, how to deliver it, the different operational components, technology, and just really the effort of timing as a new element and requirement for this disclosure took a lot more time than I think was truly anticipated. I recall, I think there was a meeting that I was in with Karen where we talked about Form CRS at the very beginning of this to say, how are we going to not only create this, but how are we going to get it out to clients, because our advisors are really going to be the ones that have to deliver it. There's that human element involved. And so making sure to comply and how to track it and record it, I truly think that was the biggest lift in the beginning because it was so prescriptive. The SEC was very clear as to what was required and is required. So making sure we checked all those boxes, followed through to the end point of how it's going to be delivered. And then also just the content itself involving compliance, risk, legal, to make sure our disclosures were appropriate and concise. Yes, it was within Form CRS, but inevitably looking at where are these disclosures and is it consistent across the board as a firm? So I think really we have all of the elements of BI, but starting with Form CRS, I think that was the first major hurdle.
Yeah, so Karen, let me turn to you. So Julie mentioned that you had conversations about Form CRS and trying to figure out how to implement it correctly. Would you agree that this was your biggest challenge, or would you think that there were other challenges that firms are grappling with?
So I think operationally, it is the biggest challenge. But if we look back to when this rule first became effective and we understood how much time we had to implement it, it required a lot of executive level engagement initially to look at all of our conflicts, to pull together the conflicts committees that had been formed under the DOL rule, tell all of those executives that they had to once again care about this issue and turn their attention to it when there was a lot of ennui, I think, across the board in dealing with fiduciary issues. And then once again, do a complete survey of all of the products offered by the company, discuss each one and its conflicts, and agree on a resolution for each of those conflicts. So while that seems like it was a long time ago, it actually wasn't that long ago, and it did take a lot of upfront planning before we could get to the stage where we were turning to the operational issues of delivery of the disclosures.
All right, thanks. Teresa, what do you think the biggest challenges firms have faced?
I would agree with my two peers here in terms of the prescriptiveness of Form CRS and just the logistics and the operational, I guess, challenges for that. But I think, another thing to just add is that while Form CRS was prescriptive, deliberately regulation best interest was not, right? That is a principles-based regulation, which I think, very supportive of and works very well. But what that means is that, there is no sort of checklist that you can follow or recipe that you can follow. It's really what makes sense for your firm, your clients, and your advisors. And so I think, one of the challenges, and I think, most companies just met it head on, was, they had to put some structure around it, right? They had to spin up, a robust formal project, and then methodically go through all of the different areas of the regulation. So, Form CRS and Reg BI disclosures, what are they doing for account level recommendations? What do they need to do to enhance their conflicts of interest process, if anything? And then, training and communication really kind of just sat across all of it. So it's great to develop new policies and procedures and new disclosures and new practices and new supervision, processes. But if you can't explain it to your advisors and train them and can't explain it to your clients, right, then it's not going to be effective. So I think it was not only developing this entire program, which, very much sort of built on the strong compliance foundation that, all of our companies already had, but it was also the training and the communication, and to be able to do that by June 30th, and to be able to do that when many people were working at home and having, God forbid, COVID, or just, market volatility issues. So I think those were some of the bigger challenges.
Yeah, so Teresa, let's follow up with that, right? So in the presence of principle-based regulation, right, you mentioned that the firm not only has to set up policies and procedures, but has to train the financial professionals and the staff and come up with education, collateral materials, and even start thinking about, continuing education requirements. Can you talk a little bit about some of the specific things that firms have developed under this new rule?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think, like I said, firms likely went through it pretty methodically. They looked at Form CRS and their Reg BI disclosures, and they looked at, what's the content? What's the delivery of that form going to look like to existing and new clients? And how do we make it easy for our advisors and the firm to deliver those documents? And how do we make sure that we can document that delivery? How do we make sure that advisors can answer the conversation starters in the Form CRS? So I think there was a lot of training around that. I think there was a lot of training, separate training sessions or modules, whether it was online or in person, around, what are these new disclosures and why are they important? What questions could you get from clients, and when is it your responsibility Mr. or Mrs. Advisor to deliver this form, and when is the firm going to do it? I think in terms of account level recommendations, I think, many firms, because of the Department of Labor rule that's, now since been vacated, but I think many firms took steps to help clients understand the difference between brokerage and advisory, and really sort of beefed up, what they already had on rollovers. And I think that firms had to institute training on those, either to remind advisors of the policies that are currently in place, or if there were any enhancements made, to communicate and train on those. And then I think, just in terms of the standard itself, right? This is a standard that very much built upon the FINRA suitability standard, but it is an increased standard. It is an enhanced standard. And I think advisors, they want to know what that means. And so I think, companies very much went through the challenge and met the challenge of putting together very robust training to help an advisor understand, what is different, and, what do you now need to document when you didn't before, and what conversations do you need to have that perhaps you weren't having before. And, so I think companies put in a lot of new stuff that they'll likely keep improving upon over the years.
Yeah, so thanks, Julie. I want to come to you next on a similar question, right? So Teresa mentioned, training and education online. Obviously, we're in the middle of a COVID pandemic, and a lot of education that a lot of firms would do, in person, now have to be done online through Teams or WebEx or Zoom or whatever it is. How have you seen how firms have been able to adapt to this environment and make sure that that the brokerage and other staff are able to comply with Reg BI?
Yes, Mike, I think really the sort of the shift we had to make from the in-person became a lot more obviously virtual, but also I think some firms may have considered even sort of having additional support, almost like a customer service line dedicated to BI, where advisors could call in and ask questions. So not only would you have maybe a webinar, you would have materials on your intranet that advisors could pick and choose from, but actually having someone to bounce questions off of and be able to answer those. I think that was a method that we at Raymond James, we decided to put into place to ramp up and be ready for June 30th, because let's face it, we all learn in different ways. We are, and so having different ways, whether it's looking at a recording, reading material, and then being able to have a dialogue, a discussion back and forth, is just another way. And I think that we're just getting more creative about how we reach out to advisors and help them understand. And I think from a home office perspective, in terms of the staff in the home office and how they're helping and to educate, the same thing. We're saying, well, this is what we're showing to advisors. But you, from a home office perspective, in your different roles, whether it's compliance, risk, whether you are in operations, everyone has to kind of learn it's a new standard. Similar to what Teresa said, I think it's just weaving it into every day and saying, this is how this new standard applies, and having to sort of repeat it and show examples. So it's going to be a continued evolution as to the content that exists today, but then going forward and then applying it to the different roles within a firm, whether you're an advisor, whether you're in a control group, or whether you're in sort of a process-oriented operations type role.
Yeah. So Teresa, so Julie mentioned that it's this training and education is not a one-way street. It's really a dialogue, right? And then one of the important things to find out about whether this training and education is effective or not is getting feedback from the financial professionals. So Teresa, can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the training education, but more specifically for the financial professionals themselves? How are they adapting to the rulemaking? How are they finding the new challenges and opportunities in the past 3 months to the implementation of Reg BI?
I think they are meeting the challenge, if you want to call it that, head on. And I think financial advisors, right, they're very much well aware of the regulatory landscape and the fact that, we've had the Department of Labor's fiduciary standard, we've had state best interest standards. Advisors already believed they were acting under a best interest standard. And I think, to them, getting prepared for, and implementing this best interest standard is just something that I think they've worked into their everyday workflow. So, and that was very deliberate on companies' parts, right? If you did your job right, you did not have a snap-on compliance effort, but you integrated, you weaved in, and you enhanced your existing policies, procedures, and practices. Because we know, just like all human beings, like financial advisors, they were and they still are supporting clients who are in an unprecedented time of financial and emotional distress, due to COVID. And even in the best of times, we know that it's more effective and efficient to integrate new regulations into existing processes and procedures. So I think, advisors were already geared up. And then I think the enhancements sort of just felt natural to them. And, while we're seeing that, there's a question here or there, which honestly is just what happens with any new regulation, there's really not been any pushback or distress from the advisors. I think they've actually really appreciated how thoughtful firms were in making this as integrated into what they're already doing today as possible.
Yeah, so let me follow up. Karen, let's look a little bit into the future. Obviously the firms have set up processes to get the initial implementation going, but there's going to be ongoing continuous monitoring and evaluation and adapting and particularly adapting to some of these questions that Teresa mentioned around the edges on stuff. So can you talk a little bit about the processes that firms have in place to assess Reg BI on a going forward basis?
Sure. I mean, I think as a starting point, as Teresa was saying, Reg BI fits into the way we do business. It's the reason that industry embraced what the SEC is doing. It's a principle-based, business model neutral rule that supports what we think our advisors already do, which is make recommendations in the best interest of clients. It's more intended to address those anecdotal bad actors or customer confusion out there that is not the majority of the way business is done. So because it wasn't a structural change or a business model change that was being required, it's sort of as we saw under the DOL rule, the supervision, the monitoring, the measurement of how Reg BI is going also fits into our way of doing business. And so I think we all set up review committees, conflict committees, investment review committees, product review committees prior to this rule as a result of the DOL transition rule. And then we modified those to address this rule, and we'll be using those on a go basis to measure the success of the rule. And it's been fairly seamless, but I will say that, we were thrown a curve by the pandemic. And there was a challenge in having to deal with fitting in training, which had intended to be in person, into a virtual world, which thankfully our company at least was very capable of doing. But we had to produce a series of videos that requires not just the lawyers determining what needs to be in those videos, but also the IT teams and the ops teams to make those available and to make them mandatory and be able to record that your sales force has actually gone through the process. And so I think there's a big operational element to regulations that needs to be better understood by the regulators. But once we build those systems into place, they're there for go forward, which is what your question was about, as we need to make changes or adjustments.
Yeah, so you mentioned conflict committees. So let's drill down a little bit on conflicts of interest, right? So Reg BI requires broker-dealers to address conflicts of interest by identifying and disclosing, or in some cases, eliminating all conflicts of interest associated with recommendations. So I have three related questions on conflicts, and Karen, I'll stick with you, and then I'll go to Julie, and then we'll hear from Teresa on this. So the three related questions are: you give some examples of how firms are approaching the conflict of interest obligation. You mentioned the conflicts committees, but maybe some other examples. And then what processes are in place to identify and evaluate potential conflicts of interest and determine how to mitigate them? And what sort of feedback are you getting from your clients in terms of understanding other potential conflicts of interest that you hadn't even thought of? Karen? So
conflicts start with products. It's looking at your product set and seeing how they compete with each other, looking at parameters around which certain clients fit into or don't fit into certain product classes. I think that's the initial review that takes place. And Reg BI focused more on conflicts between the representative and the customer than it did firm level. Firm level conflicts, which includes things like revenue streams to the firm, are able to be managed more through disclosures. So that really does focus the look at conflicts through the products committee. And that products committee has been made more robust and will continue on a more regular basis going forward. As far as feedback from clients to address conflicts, that really hasn't been the feedback that we anyway have received from Reg BI. Feedback, not surprisingly, has been more around why am I getting the same disclosure so many times repeatedly?
Yeah, Julie?
Well, I was thinking about Karen's last comment about the clients and their response. And I think the way we probably have to think about getting feedback from clients is to first sort of put out there, now that we have all these robust disclosures, new information repackaged, if you will, maybe not new, but repackaged to really provide information to clients. Now I think it's waiting and seeing that it's being provided, the responsibility of our clients, the end user clients reviewing it, because I think that's when they maybe start to take up on BI, this is the new standard, and maybe not in that way, but with these new disclosures, if they're reading the materials, whether it's the Form CRS or the Reg BI disclosures, there may be something that comes from that, because otherwise I'm not sure if they're going to proactively just sort of bring forth conflicts or things that they're thinking about without looking at the materials that I think BI is really intending them to get more sort of hands-on and understanding.
Yeah, I do want to follow up on this about whether the customers have seen, the benefits from this and are they actually reading this. But before I do that, let me ask Teresa to weigh in here on the conflicts of interest and give some examples of what you think are good practices in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree with my fellow panelists that, many firms have long had a process that predated Reg BI to identify and manage conflicts of interest. And, those conflicts committees, they met periodically to discuss potential or actual material conflicts that might impact clients. And from those committees, most firms maintain some sort of inventory of existing conflicts, like a conflicts log or inventory, and they disclose those conflicts to clients in various disclosures, before we had Form CRS and regulation best interest disclosures. So I agree that I think clients aren't seeing anything that, is so new to them that it sort of generates this need to reach out to their advisor to say what's going on. I do agree that really what you hear is, why am I getting this Form CRS so quickly after I just received one? And, we have talking points for our advisors to explain that. But just in terms of best practices, I think what firms have done is they've built upon their existing process. And whereas that process may have been more aligned with the FINRA 2013 conflicts of interest report, now it aligns more with the regulation best interest expectations. And then many have made their conflict identification or management process, more formal or even maybe automated in some sort of tool or database. So in terms of best practices, that's just what I've been seeing.
Okay, good, thanks. Julie, let me come back to you. I meant you had mentioned, the question of whether or not customers are reading this sort of thing, right? As we all know, the SEC is a disclosure-based agency, not a merit-based agency. And the idea is to come up with disclosures to promote transparency so that investors, particularly retail investors, can make better informed decisions. And there's always this balance between providing enough information for investors to make informed decisions, and then overloading them with too much information or having boilerplate disclosures and those sorts of things, right? And from the beginning, the intention of Form CRS was to keep it very short, 2 to 4 pages, just have the very basic information they need to know. How is, what sort of standard are you under? How do they get paid? Based on interest, those sorts of things. Have you gotten any evidence that A, customers are even reading this, your clients are reading these forms, and B, whether or not it is making a difference and maybe just sparking a conversation that they otherwise wouldn't have?
We don't necessarily have a feedback forum specific to, CRS and whether or not the clients are reading it. But I would have to say, based on the way Form CRS is written, the brevity of it, I think upon that initial disclosure, I would hope that seeing 2 pages would encourage someone to read it. And I think the conversation starters, I think, Teresa, you mentioned at your firm, and Karen, you probably are doing the same at yours. I think at many firms, we're equipping advisors with how to speak to the conversation starters. And I think, if anything, that beginning hook for a prospective client, existing client, to say, you know what, even if I'm not narrowing and drilling down on all the details, if I saw a conversation starter, I would hope I'd go, well, maybe I should ask this question. But in terms of the feedback form itself, we don't have one firmly in place. I think we would most likely hear something from our advisors as to their experiences with the end user client.
Yeah. So Karen, are you hearing anything directly from clients, or are you hearing anything indirectly through your financial advisors or financial professionals in terms of the questions that they're getting?
We're not, but I wouldn't read too much into that. I think it's an indication that it's going well. We're not getting pushback from the advisors or complaints that they're having difficulty responding to questions, which is what we'd be more likely to hear. We do, as Julie said, we did do training on how to respond to the conversation starters, but I think those conversation starters are well done. They're a normal part of a conversation between a client and a rep to start with.
Yeah, Teresa, anything to add here?
We put in a formal feedback loop where we reached out to our client service center to find out, how many questions we're getting from clients or how many we're getting from financial advisors, and then what are the nature of those questions. Just to make sure that, if there seems to be themes or trends or a question that keeps coming up over and over, could we put an FAQ or a client, communication out there that would address that? And we really haven't had any, right? We've had very few questions in the 3 months, and most of them are really just, logistics, like, oh, why am I getting this form? Or, questions around contents of the form. But nothing where it raised, concern that said, maybe we didn't cover something, or, there's questions out there that haven't been answered. So far, I think, like Karen said, silence, I think, is probably a good sign that clients were already used to seeing this type of information, perhaps in different disclosures, and advisors were already pretty comfortable talking about these issues. And then hopefully the conversation starters, as Julie said, just kind of structure on how to have those discussions.
Okay. Now let me turn to examinations by the SEC and or FINRA on Reg BI and Form CRS, right? So, when the SEC promulgates a rule, that's not the end of it, right? There's also a lot of questions and feedback, and then the SEC monitors enforcement or monitors compliance with the different regulations. It's only been 3 months, but we know the SEC, and in fact, FINRA has been out there examining some firms, or even just getting some information about how firms are complying. And in July, the SEC reported that many firms are doing well with the new disclosure requirements, but at the same time, some firms are falling short. Now, not with respect to your particular firms in particular, but in terms of, I know you talk to people in the industry all the time. Have you heard any information about, how the SEC is approaching their Reg BI examinations, and how FINRA is doing the same with the, they have focus on, the CRS also in the Reg BI exams. Teresa, any insight into terms of what you're hearing out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I've heard is the consensus experience is that mostly the SEC has asked the list of questions that they put out earlier to guide firms on what questions they might ask in an exam. And so what I've been hearing is that the questions are almost one for one from what they foreshadowed would be coming. And so I think what most companies did was start their normal exam readiness process based on, the potential questions in anticipation of an exam that might look at these areas, and then aren't surprised by the questions that they've been getting. And then what I understand from FINRA is that they are following the same. They're following the same approach and looking at those questions, and that they are trying to make sure between the SEC that they divide up examinations amongst firms so that not one firm is getting an exam from both regulators and then another firm is not hearing from anybody.
Wow. Okay. So no surprises, and they're coordinating well with FINRA. So those are always good things to hear. That's great. Karen or Julie, anything to add to that?
No, I would echo very much what Teresa said. I've heard the same commentary.
Yeah, we also have the same feedback, and we're appreciative of how FINRA has really put an effort into working with the SEC to coordinate on this rule. Okay.
All right. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so we'll do a final round of questions here, right? So what we've learned from this has been very insightful. It's you all have done a heck of a lot of work. Your three firms plus the industry in general has done a heck of a lot of work, implementing the Reg BI and Form CRS this today. The work in progress, both on the rulemaking front and in terms of the compliance front. I'd like to get your views on the future of Reg BI. Are you optimistic for the future of Reg BI to set a strong broker-dealer standard of conduct and to help retail investors make informed choices? Karen, why don't we start with you?
Yes, we are optimistic. We are pleased with the outcome of the rule. We were pleased that the SEC spent a lot of time taking comments and input from industry to get it right, and we view it as an improvement.
Great. Teresa?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that firms were already making enhancements for the benefit of clients, and I think Reg BI fit very well into these efforts. It provided clear guidance and a structure for approaching consumer protection. And I just hope that, because of that, faith in the system increases. Because I think, the more that clients work with financial advisors, studies show that they save more for emergency funds, right? They don't cash out of their retirement plans during job transition. They save for their children's retirement, for education without putting their retirement at risk. So I am very optimistic, and I think we'll hopefully continue to see good things.
Great. Julie?
Yes, I'm in agreement with both what Teresa and Karen said. And I would also just say that I'm very optimistic and looking forward to the continued interaction with the SEC and FINRA, especially as we just find out more about what BI will be in the future in terms of just clarity. I think that we're headed in the right direction. And I do think what advisors in our industry already has in place, this is building upon that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for a great discussion. I want to thank you for, great, insightful discussion on the implementation of Reg BI and Form CRS, right? As a former regulator, you can have the best of intentions, but it's really where the rubber meets the road is when in the implementation of this. And it's the very thoughtful feedback from your firms individually and through the chamber on behalf of all of their members that can actually help make this work for all everyday Americans, Main Street investors. So thank you all for joining us for this. And I also want to thank our host, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in particular, the Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness, for arranging and facilitating this very important discussion at this time. At this time, I'll turn it over to Kristen Malanconico from the Chamber for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Mike. This is Kristen Malanconico, Director with CCMC. It was really a great conversation and very fascinating. I'd like to thank Dr. Piwowar for moderating our panel, and thank you to all of our panelists, Julia Rue, Teresa Sace, and Karen Sukin for participating, for providing great insights on the various and many issues surrounding Reg BI implementation. I'd say going forward, we expect to continue monitoring the issues surrounding Reg BI implementation, as well as potential changes from states that are seeking to adopt their own fiduciary rules. And so we'll continue to stay engaged on those and make sure our member firms are engaged as well. So we'll look forward to being in touch and keeping you informed of any of these developments, and that'll include some future webinars, we hope. So thank you all for participating today, and have a great remainder of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.